Hi, my name is Ashley Leung. I'm a third-year graduate student at the University of Chicago, and today I'm really excited to share my work looking at how parents scaffold the formation of conversational pacts with their children. This is work in collaboration with Robert Hawkins at Princeton and Dan Urofsky at Carnegie Mellon. We all spend a lot of our time every day in conversation with other people. An important basis for successful communication is common ground. We need to understand other people and also know that we're going to understand each other. And one way to do that is through the establishment of conversational pacts. So let's take an example of how conversational pacts are formed. Let's say we are playing this game. In this game, you are defusing a bomb and I have the manual. We can't look at each other, but we can talk to one another. Let's say you have to describe this particular symbol to me so that we can defuse the bomb. How might you call it? You might say it looks like an eye with a curly X on top, a weird insect, or maybe you have a different name for this symbol. And all of those are valid as long as you can get me to understand you. In the past, when I've played this game with my husband, we've quite quickly converged upon a referent name, MTR sign, for this symbol. Now, the label MTR sign probably means nothing to most of you, and that's because you don't share the same common ground that we do. The common ground that I share with my husband that allowed us to come upon MTR sign as a referent name is that we both grew up in Hong Kong. In the subway system, the MTR has this logo. And so you might think, well, this is a very specific example. We're talking about novel reference, weird symbols. Of course, conversational pacts are helpful. But do they have practical significance beyond weird symbols? And they do. When talking about a simple object, for example, there are many ways to refer to it. We could call this a white shoe, a sneaker, just a shoe. And in fact, even daily objects require that we implicitly or explicitly agree upon a referent name. How I refer to something will make it more likely for you to refer to the same thing in the same way. And like I just showed you, these conversational pacts are partner specific. They are also flexible and they can change with the goals in the task at hand. And ultimately, conversational pacts facilitate efficient communication. It allows us to communicate about reference quite quickly while making sure that we are understood by our conversational pact partners. So it seems like these are quite intuitive. We do conversational pacts all the time. It'd be easy, right? But if you take a step back and think about it, it's really not that trivial. To form a conversational pact, we need to think about what our conversational partner knows, think about what they know we know, think about what they know that we know that they know, and so on and so forth. And if we think about the large number of people that we hold conversation with, it really becomes quite tricky. And in fact, we know that young children do struggle to form conversational pacts with their peers. In a study by Krause and Glucksberg, they invited children from kindergarten up through 9th grade to play this matcher-director game, where children had to talk to one another about these novel objects in this game where they can't see each other. And so what they found was that children even up to 7th grade struggled really to maintain about a 50% accuracy across all trials. And importantly, their accuracy did not increase, which we see in most adult referential study games and would be expected if they did understand each other, right? Imagine if you had formed a pact, you should get faster, get more accurate because you do have common ground with the other person. What Krause and Glucksberg did find, though, was that when experimenters offered explicit instruction, explicit feedback about the mistakes children were making, most children did improve their accuracy. However, this was still not the case for the youngest children, the kindergartners. So what might be happening with these youngest children such that they can't really converge in conversational pacts with their partners, even when given explicit feedback? Well, Krause and Glucksberg decided to take a look at the labels that the children themselves are generating. Don't worry about catching all the details here. I'll zoom into two parts of this graph. So one way that children could be failing is that they are failing to negotiate with their partners. They're failing to realize that what I see is different from what you see, and what I think looks like a doll doesn't look like a doll to you. And so we do see some suggestion of that here in the idiosyncrasy of children's labels. These are 5 different children's labels for this particular novel object, and you could see how maybe it's quite hard to really converge on one pact. Another explanation could be that children are producing such inconsistent and uninformative referring expressions that labels they themselves generate aren't even helpful for themselves. Suggestion of that could be here. This is one child's labels for all 6 novel objects. You'll see here in the 4th and 5th object is called daddy shirt and another daddy shirt. So I'd be quite suspicious whether or not this child really would be able to use these labels in any sort of consistent manner. What Krause and Glucksberg found was that when an experimenter sat down and played this game with children using only the labels the children generated, almost all the children were correct all of the time. So it does seem to suggest that where children are failing is in negotiating with another person's perspective. But ultimately, what Krause and Glucksberg's work is able to tell us is that adults' feedback and instruction, as well as adult adaptation, could improve performance. Giving explicit feedback on mistakes, as well as perhaps taking the perspective of the child, could facilitate successful communication in young children. And so we can think about how children have conversation in general. We all know that children at a fairly young age are probably capable of having conversations. So how could that be if these studies are showing that children are quite bad at referring to things in a way that allows others to understand them? Well, one possible explanation is that the adults or older speakers in the children's lives are already doing these kinds of adaptations, albeit maybe not as scripted or not as formalized. So we ask this question: do parents scaffold children's formation of conversational pacts? Are they making the kinds of adaptations and giving the kinds of feedback that Krauss and Blitzberg did when they themselves were experimenters? So we designed an experiment. We used a matcher-director paradigm like the one I showed you, but we used slightly different novel objects. I'll show you those in a bit. We invited 63 parent-child pairs to play the game. Children were ages 4, 6, and 8. We wanted to look at developmental change in both children as well as parents of kids of different ages. We had 20 pairs of adults as control. And importantly here, both the parent and the child got to be director and matcher. So parents described things sometimes, children described things sometimes, and children didn't only just hear things described to them. So here's the design of the study. We used 10 different tangram objects. Here are all 10 of them. And at the beginning of each game, we have code that randomizes these 10 tangrams, and it randomly assigns 5 of these tangrams for the parent to be director first, and then 5 for the child to describe first. And each of these tangrams repeated 4 times throughout the game. So we had 4 blocks of 10 trials, so we could see how referring expressions to each tangram changed over the game. So if you were the director on a certain tangram in the first round, you would be matcher on the second round, director again on the third round, and finally matcher again on the final round. And so everybody had 2 opportunities to be director as well as matcher for each given tangram in this game. Now let's take a look at the setup. We had parents and children sit across from each other. There's a divider so they can't look at each other's iPad screens. And whoever was the director would see 2 tangram images as well as a cue for which one is the target. The matcher would see the same tangram images, but no cue, of course. Now let's take a look at an example of a parent and child interacting during this game. In this particular trial, the child is the director, and they're trying to describe this particular tangram as noted by the red cue. Let's see what they said.
This one looks like it's architecture.
Okay, does it look like it maybe has like a square and a triangle on the bottom?
Well, yes.
Yes. Okay.
And so we transcribed everybody's utterances in the same way. We wrote down everything that they said throughout the game, and we looked at the referring expressions, the things that were in reference to the tangram. We looked at both what the director was saying and what the matcher was saying each time. And in this example, for example, you could see that the parent actually responds to the child before giving a response. And this will be shown in our data a bit later as well. So in analyzing our data, we asked 3 big questions. First of all, how successfully do young children communicate with their parents? How are parents scaffolding pact formation with their children? And finally, who is adapting to whom? And so let's jump into our first question. How successfully do young children communicate with their parents? We find in our study that young children can communicate successfully with their parents in this situation, which is in contrast to previous studies showing that children fail to communicate with their peers. So we'll see here that accuracy is quite high across the board, even for our youngest children, which is the darkest blue line here. And importantly, we do find that with the 4-year-old and their parents, accuracy increases across the game, which is sort of evidence that they are converging on a better way to describe tangrams, or at least they understand each other, which was not found in previous children's studies. Then we wanted to look at how their referring expressions changed over the game. A hallmark finding with adults in these kinds of referential games is that referring expressions get shorter over time as an index that they are converging upon more efficient ways to communicate about novel objects. So I'll first show you our own adult data. Here we see a very nice decrease, almost linear decrease, such that adults start out by talking more about a certain tangram, and then by the final round of the game, they're using much fewer words. And in very exciting news, we replicate this finding in all of the age groups with parents and children. So we'll see here that 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds, and their parents all show this kind of decrease in the number of words they're using per exchange to describe a tangram throughout the game. And again, this is evidence for us that they are converging on at least more efficient ways of describing a tangram, and that their patterns of conversation might quite closely mirror what adult conversation looks like, albeit it seems like all of them use slightly more words overall. And we actually do find an effect of age. So not in the words per exchange per se, but we find that parents and their 4-year-olds take more conversational turns. So in this plot, instead of number of words, I'm plotting number of exchanges per round, how many back and forth parents and children are taking. And we find that 4-year-olds and their parents on average take one more conversational turn. So this could look like asking a question, repeating something that another person said, but they take more conversational turns. That's interesting here. We wanted to know, what are parents and their 4-year-olds doing? How are parents engaging differently with 4-year-olds? And so let's jump into our second big question. How are parents scaffolding pact formation with children? Are they making the kinds of adaptations that Krauss and Glucksberg did as experimenters, like I shared? We first find that parents, when they are directors, are talking more to younger children. So this is when parents are themselves describing the tangrams. So first of all, I'm again going to show you adult data and how many words you're talking, how many words you're producing when talking about a tangram. Again, you see this, it's basically the same graph as just now. But now splitting up by how many words parents versus children are producing when they are directors, you see this big gap here in the 4-year-old age group. So parents of 4-year-olds are talking much more when they're directors compared to when their children are directors. So it looks like parents might be scaffolding children in the way that they are producing more information to allow their children to select the correct tangrams, to facilitate communicative success. You might think, well, that's all great, but what are parents doing when they themselves are matchers? Do they act differently when their children are directing them? And so we took a look at that too. We took a look at whether parents ask questions to their young children. And we look at questions because that could be a nice index of prompting for more information, asking for confirmation, like the example that you saw earlier. And we do find that parents of 4-year-olds are more likely to be asking questions when these 4-year-olds are directors. So when a 4-year-old perhaps initiates a reference such as it looks like architecture, these parents are asking questions to really probe them for a bit more information. So we see here again evidence of parents scaffolding both when they are directors and matchers, perhaps to help children through these referential situations that might be difficult for them otherwise. And finally, we want to ask, who is adapting to whom? Remember I said that one way to facilitate successful communication would be for parents to fully take up anything that their child says. Whatever your child says, just copy them and take their perspective completely. And that could allow for successful communication. And so we wanted to know, who are the people who initiate successful conversational pacts? By successful, we mean things that stick around to the end. Who brings the referring expression that ends up sticking in the final round? So here's an example of a 6-year-old and their parent interacting on this particular tangram. Parent starts by saying, looks like someone who might be kneeling and praying. In the second round, the child says this. Third round, the parent says this. In the final round, the child says, it looks like someone like praying. So how we measured successful conversational pacts was by comparing the final round utterance to the first round utterance. Across age groups, we looked at the proportion of words in your final utterance that were introduced by your partner in the first round. So here we would be saying, it looks like someone like praying. What proportion of these words came from that first sentence generated by the parent? It looks like someone who might be like kneeling and praying. So I'll show you first with adults. We see that the majority of final round expressions came from words introduced by the partner. So this is what we predicted. That means that there is some conversational pact formation happening, that you are taking up what your partner said in the first round and it's sort of stuck around till the end. And so now we wanted to look at parents and children. If the parent line is way up high, that suggests parents are taking up children's conversational pacts. But if the child's line is higher than the parent's line, that suggests that children are taking up parents' conversational pact. And we find the latter. We find that particularly for the youngest children, the 4-year-olds, children are much more likely to be taking up their parents' conversational pact, such that a large majority of words produced by children on the final round came from the first round utterances by their parents. So this suggests to us that parents might be the ones who are able to produce a referring expression that really fits the tangram, that they are scaffolding children by helping them produce an informative referring expression for each tangram. So again, what did we find? We found that children can communicate successfully with their parents with pretty high accuracy, and accuracy increases throughout the game. Their patterns of conversation quite closely mimic adult conversation. We also find that parents do scaffold conversational pact formation, both when they are directors, speaking more to young children, and when they are matchers, asking more questions when their young children are directors. And finally, we also saw parents as the initiator of conversational pacts, perhaps as the ones who produce the most informative ways of describing a tangram, allowing their children to then actually take up their pact. And ultimately, our work points to the importance of looking at interactions, and particularly interactions between young children and older, more fluent speakers, as a key to studying how children learn to communicate in the way that we know they eventually do, and how they learn to navigate these referential settings. With that, I would like to thank my co-authors, everyone in the lab, and all of you for listening. I'll be around for some questions, and you can always email your questions to me. Thank you very much.